Hey everyone, Sharkheart here, and I want to show you how I made a functional wine barrel out of foam. This all started with a friend of mine who has a big Halloween party that I got invited to after I told her I made a functioning wine box costume. It became so infamous among our friend group that even my friend's parents knew me by my costume, and only by my costume. Hey mom, Shark is gonna come over today. Who? You know, Shark with the wine box. Oh, wine box Shark, why didn't you say so? And as a result, I wore this costume every Halloween since I've known this particular friend group. But one friend, let's call him Jealous B, complained that I wore this costume too much and that he's had enough of my awesome handcrafted costume and that I needed to have a different costume. So I decided I needed to upgrade the wine box to something more distinguished, a wine barrel, and I still wanted it to function with a working wine spout. I tried finding a real barrel at first, but considering I'm 6'3" or 190 centimeters tall, that was not going to work, especially because a barrel that would fit me would also weigh about as much as I do. So I decided to make the barrel out of foam and document the entire process, but since I don't have any special studio setup, I had just used my phone. And before I could make my first ever foam costume from scratch, I had a very important task that is truly everyone's favorite: math. I sketched out the design I wanted with the size of the openings for the top and the bottom, as well as the middle. Since barrels have a curve to them, I did separate calculations for how tapered I wanted each of the boards or staves to be. This ended up becoming a problem, as we'll see in a bit, but without these calculations it would have been so much worse. I also calculated the amount of foam I would need to have as little waste as possible, and ended up using 2 large foam sheets with enough left over for a cork as well as the bands that go around the barrel. Once I had my design, it was time to prototype to see if my math was correct. I took butcher paper and cut out mock examples of the staves and taped them together. I just wanted to see if this was the right length and diameter, so these didn't really need to hold together very well. I calculated for 20 staves because that made the math easier, but it also made the barrel feel like there weren't too many or too few staves. Everything looked good, so I started cutting the foam. I traced around a prototype stave I made out of paper and then started cutting. I used a utility knife at first, but scissors worked just as well and were a lot easier to handle. I cut out 20 staves, then quickly checked to make sure they all aligned and curved with each other, and then I proceeded to start adding cuts and grooves and to distress the foam to make it look like wood. First I used a wire brush, and it does a pretty good job on its own, especially if you drag the brush in a slightly curved pattern. It ends up having a pretty nice wood grain look. But overall the result was too uniform and the distressing wasn't deep enough. So I drew on a unique wood grain pattern on each board with a marker, and then I proceeded to use a rotary tool to make notches and patterns in the foam to make it look more and more like wood. But before I did any cutting, I made sure to wear a dust mask and goggles. Working on this project makes a ton of particles, irritants, and fumes, and you don't want those in your eyes or lungs. And the mask that I got just so happened to come with goggles, so this was definitely worth it, and if you want to see any of the supplies or safety gear that I used, I'll have links to those in the description for everything. So after donning my dust mask and goggles, I began the very tedious process of using a rotary tool to carve out patterns in the foam to make it really look like wood. Once I finished, I primed the foam to get it ready for paint. It made me realize that this primed white foam looks awesome, and I considered stopping here, but I wanted my barrel to have a rich red and brown look, so I continued painting. I used 3 colors of paint: an orange yellow, a reddish brown, and a darker brown that had a little bit of a warm tone. I wanted the barrel to have an overall warm feel, so I looked for colors that had red or orange to them. I painted each stave in layers and experimented to see which got the best results. On one stave I started with a yellow base, on another I started with a reddish-brown base, and on another I started with a dark base. I tried different color combinations in order to see which I liked the most. I then added Mod Podge after the first layer to act as a sealant, but I decided I wanted to paint directly on the Mod Podge with a dry brush because it gave the foam a nice texture when it finished. But sometimes I wasn't really satisfied with the results and I would just start all over and paint new layers. I found that taking a slightly damp paper towel and removing just a little bit of the surface paint as it's still wet made for a really nice effect and made the foam look even more like wood. Among all of the paint layering, I really liked the light yellow-orange color as a base, so I painted all 20 staves a light yellow, then added some reddish brown, and then some darker brown last. The result ended up looking really nice, like a rich old wood that's seen a lot, but there were still a lot of details that were missing. So I used a little bit of dark brown paint, a tiny brush, and began to fill in the cracks and make the wood grain really stand out. This was an extra tedious step, and honestly the results are pretty subtle, but I really liked the way it transformed the look. Next I began to glue the staves using rubber cement. Everything was going fine until I realized I had tapered the staves too much. The taper should have started at the top and bottom thirds of each stave, instead of going all the way to the middle from each end. When the taper goes all the way to the middle, as I made it, the center tends to bow out more than it normally should. But by this point I was not going to redo everything, so I just accepted what it was and moved on. Next on the list was the cork. I got a peel and stick cork material and wrapped it around a cardboard container I had. I left the cork pretty long for testing, but ended up cutting it shorter for the final project. Next was the wine holder. I used a reusable wine bag that I got off Amazon and a sturdy cardboard crate used for carrying bananas. I did some more math, made a housing for the wine bag, filled it up halfway, and started cutting and gluing to make a wine holder that I could fit inside the barrel. I glued the wine holder inside the barrel, but it didn't feel sturdy enough, so I used a ton of cardboard and hot glue to reinforce the inside. Then I cut holes for my arms and the cork, and after fitting the cork inside, I tested everything and it worked beautifully. With the leftover foam, I spray painted 2 brass bands around the top and bottom, and made 2 brass buttons that made it look like the bands were riveted together. And after a lot of work, my wine barrel is complete. I hope you enjoyed seeing how I made this, even if I had to use my phone to record most of it. If you want to see all the materials I used, check out the links in the description, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video and live on stream.